Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar, Conflict of Interest and Industry Interference in Food Policy in the Caribbean. We're delighted that you've taken time out of your day to join us today. We have a wonderful array of panelists and speakers who will be sharing their expertise and experience in this very complex area. The aims of the webinar are really twofold. The first one is to share the Make It Make Sense campaign, and the second one is to discuss experiences and lessons learned in dealing with this issue of conflict of interest and industry interference in healthy food policy making across the Caribbean. We're going to start with welcoming and opening remarks from Sir Trevor Hassell, the president of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. We will then go to our communication consultant, Ms. Tammy Marie, who will present the Make It Make Sense campaign. I'll then give you a 101 on COI and industry interference. And then we'll go to moderator, Dr. Kenneth Connell, who is also the vice president of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition, to moderate really what we hope will be a rich panel discussion on this issue. So before we move ahead into the welcome and opening remarks, I'd like to remind everyone that the webinar will be recorded, and we encourage you to use the chat function and the Q&A function to ask questions and to engage with the speakers. We would like this to be a rich and interactive discussion. Over to you, Sir Trevor.
So thanks very much. Thanks very much, Maisha. And I'd like to join you in welcoming everyone to today's webinar. As I do so, I'd like to, as it were, set the scene for today's webinar. Now, for quite some time, the HCC has been aware of gaps and deficiencies in the management of conflict of interest in public health policy making in the Caribbean. This has resulted in opportunities for interference by vested interests in the making of such policies. The situation has been made even more complex in the region as a result of vested and sectoral interests making the case and having some traction for a direct role in public health policy making. Unfortunately, it appears that the multi-sectoral approach with private sector engagement is being in fact elevated in the Caribbean to private sector determination of public health policy making. This set of circumstances has resulted in delays, especially in NCD public health policy making. For example, in healthy school environments, in the tax on sugary sweetened beverages, and front of package nutritional warning labels, to name but a few. And so over the years, HCC and its partners have responded aimed at timely, effective NCD policies by hosting webinars, providing reports, publishing opinion pieces, producing advertorials, and engaging in advocacy campaigns. Today's webinar is part of that ongoing effort, when the most recent advocacy campaign will be promoted, and there will be in-depth discussion on conflict of interest and industry interference. It's against this background then, I personally look forward to the discussions today, and I hope that there will be the fullest participation by all attendees in this very complex but particularly important issue. Thanks very much, Maisha.
Thank you, Sir Trevor. I would like now to invite Tammy Marie, to share on the Make It Make Sense campaign. Tammy, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Tammy, and I am the communications consultant for Make It Make Sense, which is a digital media campaign that aims to build support for evidence-based policies to improve the NCD epidemic in the Caribbean by raising awareness about conflicts of interest and interference around food policy development. As Sir Trevor mentioned, the HCC works tirelessly to promote healthier food environments and address NCDs by advocating for key public health measures like taxes on sugary drinks, mandatory front of package nutrition warning labels, school environment regulations, and marketing restrictions, especially to children and adolescents, but industry interference and weak management of conflicts of interest are a major barrier to the adoption and implementation of these evidence-based policies in our region. So Make It Make Sense aims to highlight to our governments and to the public the tactics that ultimately undermine food policy formulation and implementation, and the need to protect our policy making processes from influence of entities with vested interests. I will share what the graphics look like. And so these are the 6 graphic cards that were created for the Make It Make Sense campaign. And we'll also share one of the videos for the campaign. There are a total of 4 of them.
Consultations are great, but expecting food companies to fairly influence decision-making around healthy food policies? Please, make this make sense.
Thank you, Tammy, for sharing the campaign and the reasoning behind it. I wanted to ask you a question before you left. We've seen in other countries backlash to campaigns, similar campaigns, and we were wondering can you share with the audience the process that you and the team went through in designing the campaign? And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the partnership of the Jamaica Youth Advocacy Network, the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Barbados, and the Heart Foundation of Jamaica. And can you share the process that you and the team went through in designing the campaign to really try to maximize the impact, but while balancing mitigation of any possible risks associated with kind of calling out the actions of such powerful economic actors? Yeah,
good question. So, the public opinion governs the workings of our society, and especially post-COVID, the food and beverage industry, or just like the private sector in general, has created a real or perceived sense in the public arena that they're an indispensable actor, particularly in the area of food insecurity. It's a sensitive area for reasons all of us know, and our goal was not and is not to villainize the private sector or the food and beverage industry. It's really to raise the public understanding of that fundamental and clear conflict of interest or conflict between an unhealthy food brand's interest and public health policy interest. So what we tried here, and as you mentioned, it was a very collaborative approach, was to design a campaign that really draws attention to some of the common systematic and sophisticated tactics that are deployed and really undermine the efforts to promote healthier food environments and ultimately interfere with food policy development by winning goodwill for the industry among both the public and policymakers.
Thank you, Tammy. That was great. So before we get into the panel, I'm going to share a quick presentation on conflict of interest, just to ensure that we are all on the same page. So here we go. So I wanted to start with this slide, basic slide. We're talking about this category of diseases, and NCDs are non-communicable diseases, and we know what those diseases are. We know that they are driven by 5 modifiable risk factors: unhealthy diets, tobacco use, harmful use of alcohol, physical inactivity, and recently added air pollution. What's important for us to remember is, these diseases are responsible for 8 out of every 10 deaths. They're responsible for almost half of premature deaths. Amongst children, we're seeing levels that are very concerning. 1 in 3 children are overweight or obese, and adult rates of obesity are even more troubling. And they're costing our Caribbean governments hundreds of millions of dollars annually in direct and indirect healthcare costs. And that last image there really points to the fact that we are off target. We're not reaching our targets. We're highly unlikely to reach the 2025 targets, much less the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we have to ask ourselves, why are we not reaching them? Why are we not making a dent in this group of diseases? And this brings me to this idea of commercial determinants of health. And this WHO definition here is commercial determinants of health are the private sector activities that affect people's health positively, and that's important there, but also negatively. And for the purpose of this presentation, we're really focusing on those that are negative. And so when we think of those risk factors, as well as the commercial determinants of health, we start to think of this idea of unhealthy products or unhealthy commodities. And these are ultra-processed food products, those that are high in what we call public nutrients of public health concern, sodium, sugars, trans fats, saturated fats, that we know when consumed in excess lead to NCDs, tobacco products, and alcohol. And so tackling these NCDs really means regulating those products. And when we regulate them, we decrease the consumption of those products. And that has kind of two potential impacts. One is that we start to see a reduction in illness, and we start to see a reduction in the expenditure on health. And then at the same time, we also may start to see a reduction in profits from those entities that produce the benefit from the production of these products or these unhealthy commodities. And therein is where we realize the kind of tension. We seek to regulate, but then these companies who are profiting from the products oftentimes are in the regulatory process. And that's when we start to think about conflicts of interest. And the definition of conflicts of interest is when you see a situation in which concerns or aims of two different parties are incompatible, right? So they are in direct conflict. And this results in competing priorities and interests with undue influence that interferes with performance, decision-making processes, outcomes, putting objectivity and fairness at risk, often for organizational, institutional, or personal gain at the expense of public health policy. And this is an image from our most recent campaign, allowing food policies to influence policies that regulate products they profit from, I mean, this is a real conflict of interest. And so what is industry interference? Two very linked concepts. Well, when you have poor conflict of interest, and I always remember kind of just an expert, global expert, who's thankfully, we're so appreciative he's on the call today, Jeff Collin, in a webinar with us telling us about conflict of interest is really essential for good governance. And when you don't have proper conflict of interest safeguards, you open the door for industry interference. And so this is when members of the unhealthy commodities industries attempt to negatively influence, and by this we mean delay, dilute, or derail the development of implementation of regulation, which negatively impacts their profits. And so I've got some examples across the bottom here. The first one is just a news article, and that's really from 2016, when then Prime Minister of Barbados was approached by a major global SSB manufacturer, directly really asking the Barbados government to not move forward on the SSB tax. And the Prime Minister is very open about this in the article. And needless to say, they said thank you, but no thank you. But that's a very good example of interference. The other two images, Barbara from Jamaica will share on these, I'm sure, in her remarks. And the final one was a headline from a Forbes article in relation to front of package warning labeling, again highlighting the tension that we start to see when we get public interference from the private sector in policymaking. And these are some examples of the tactics that we see that some actors in industry use to undermine public health policy, very much taken from the tobacco industry playbook and modified. And to a large extent, what we're seeing now, it's guided. Our kind of regional actors are guided by global food and beverage industry. And you can read the list along the left. I wanted to close this brief kind of intro with a comment from Margaret Chan way back in 2013, just highlighting how long this has been an issue. And she really says the efforts to prevent NCDs go against the business interests of very powerful economic actors. And she highlights this as one of the biggest challenges facing health. It's not just big tobacco anymore. Public health must also contend with big food, big soda, and big alcohol. And all of these industries fear regulation and protect themselves by using these same tactics. So I hope that was helpful in setting the scene. I'm going to hand over now to our Vice President, Dr. Connell, who will introduce the panelists and get our panel going.
So thank you, Maisha. And needless to say, I'm very excited to chair this panel because this conversation is so dear to my heart. But first, I want to let you know who our panelists are. We have, of course, you've just heard Mrs. Maisha Hutton, who is the Executive Director of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. Ms. Barbara McGraw, who is the Project Manager, Global Health Advocacy Project, the Heart Foundation of Jamaica, and ACC has done a lot of work with Heart Foundation of Jamaica. Mrs. Nicole Foster, who's a law lecturer at the esteemed Cave Hill campus and head of Law and Health Research Unit, the Faculty of Law here at Cave Hill in Barbados. And she's also an ACC policy technical advisor. Ms. Daniel Walwyn, who is the Advocacy Officer, Healthy Caribbean Coalition as well, and Healthy Caribbean Youth. And Danielle, I checked your webinar yesterday, actually, I think it was on briefly. Ms. Annalie Gray, who is a nutritionist, researcher, Caribbean Institute for Health and Research, CARE. And last but not least, Professor Jeff Collin, who's a global public health unit, who is at the Global Public Health Unit, the School of Social and Political Science, the University of Edinburgh. And I'm guessing, Jeff, that where you are, it's a lot later and cooler, perhaps, as well. So let's freeze in. Let's get right into it. So, Maisha, I'm going to put you in the batting lineup, and hopefully you do better than the West Indies team. But has conflict of interest and industry interference really impacted and undermined the NCD policy in the Caribbean? How has it impacted it? And secondly, what makes the issue particularly challenging for small island developing states?
Thanks, Kenneth. I think I want to go back to that comment that Jeff made so many years ago that keeps resonating with this idea that conflict of interest policy and safeguards is really part of good health governance. And we've seen that in the region, we really are challenged with weak conflict of interest safeguards. And we see those kinds of safeguards in other sectors, but we're not seeing them in health. And this lack of those has really opened the door for interference. And we've seen this in consultations. And I think part of the problem is that we have a very institutional commitment to multisectorality. And that multisectorality has not only governed consultations, but I recall a conversation I had with Sir Trevor recently when we were talking about this issue and how, basically he'd said, multisectorality has elevated from not just, consultations and engagement, but also into decision-making and governance. And I think we know in this space that those with vested interests should not be around the policy-making table. And that's where we find ourselves. And we've seen this in particular with the front of package warning labeling at a regional level. And the lack of conflict of interest safeguards really creates a situation often where there's lack of transparency and lack of accountability. And it makes it very challenging for civil society actors and those in public health, indeed, even beyond just advocates, to hold the process to account. It's particularly challenging in our small communities, and I'm sure you'll hear this repeatedly from other panelists. We have actors wearing multiple hats, and those hats are often in tension. We have industries that are heterogeneous. So they don't have a single unhealthy product line or healthy product line. They are basically health neutral, health supporting, health harming all together. So it's very difficult to draw red lines and create boundaries. And then there's also a very real power asymmetry, right? We have these very powerful economic actors who play an incredible role, especially in times like we've just experienced with COVID, where there are economic issues. And they often have a very privileged, high-level access to decision makers. And I'm going to pause there.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant introduction. So if I'm hearing you correct, in the meeting room or at the table, it's not just equal voices for all stakeholders, right? Health has to have a much stronger voice. In fact, if there is a conflict of interest, that stakeholder should not be in the meeting room at all. Yeah, and so this kind of sideways into a Caribbean example, hopefully that Barbara will be able to draw on there. So Barbara, can you share the Jamaican experience with industry interference in front of package labeling and maybe highlight the influence of that power asymmetry? Because I'm thinking Jamaica, you've had some major efforts in this area. What kind of pushback have you gotten?
I want to endorse everything that Maisha had said. And I think that this is one of the things that has caused this whole challenge. The pandemic and the very useful role that the food industry played in supporting governments, in supporting healthcare workers, all sorts of things, So the opposition to front of package happened, it's actually been going on for years. There was actually a headline saying, we fight the JMEA, which is the manufacturers and exporters, they'll fight to the death not to have front of package labeling. And we had a evidence-based, because you know everything coming out of the Heart Foundation is evidence-based. So through CrossQ, the regional body that chose Octagon, we didn't choose Octagon. That was based on research. The National Mirror Committee in Jamaica was asked to vote on this. And what happened is that it's almost like a movie, Kenneth. I don't know what to tell you. In other words, we had meetings, we had particular votes, and the votes were changed. And we have nothing in writing, and I have to be very careful, but our assumption is, or what we heard, is that some of the entities were asked to change their vote. So Jamaica ended up voting against the standard, which of course was very, very stressful to us. But, you know, talking about the power asymmetrics, the fact is that there are some of the industries, I have to say, some of them are good. Some of them want to reformulate. Some of them don't even mind having labels. When we had our webinars, some of the ones that we actually had with HCC, some of the cottage industry came to us and said, you know, we want to know how to put on the labels. We want to be more competitive. So it's really homogeneous, as you're saying. It's not everybody, you know. And in terms of the relationship with governments, in terms of what they were doing for COVID, you have to pick your battles as well. You know, you're not able to go hard and fast with everybody that shows, you know, some level of industry interference. So I would say that's about it in a nutshell.
Sure, thanks for sharing that. But you raised a very interesting point. You know, it's almost like having an election where we're casting doubt on the voting and the election, and that's a problem, because essentially, even if the room is clean, you might have manipulation after the vote has been made, which is theory.
We couldn't believe it. It was like a movie. We just went to reconfirm, and all of a sudden people changed the votes. It was a nightmare.
And was an explanation given for that, or no?
Well, how are you going to do it? Because some of the persons who may have been supportive of us basically talked in code. They were told, because if you are representing an organization, you can't represent your personal opinion. Your personal opinion may be different. So if they were directed to have a particular opinion, then they had to share that. You know, it's a lessening point though.
Sure.
It's a lessening point.
So you do have some inside information as to why the vote might have been changed. Daniel, I see you're already up on the screen and you have the Caribbean backdrop behind you. Hopefully my geography is correct. So you manage HCC's industry interference, conflict of interest, and marketing tracker. Can you share the types of trends you are seeing, sponsorships and marketing to children, especially, and young people?
Yes, thanks, Dr. Connell. It's one of the most interesting aspects of my job. So just to give a little background on the database. So we manage or kind of monitor some of the major food and beverage actors across the region, the focus on Barbados and Jamaica. And we look at their social media, we kind of have a look at the news, and we also have some members of our network on the ground who can kind of snap some images that they might see. So I would say that there are 4 major trends that I've kind of seen over the last year or two. One is this increase in digital marketing. And we saw that this happened as COVID happened. We were on our computers or digital devices more than ever before. And the food and beverage actors took advantage of that. And they were marketing to children more than, again, ever before. And one of the most interesting tactics that they've used is child influencers. So having children market products to other children. So that's one thing that we've seen. And I would say, you know, in our ongoing advocacy for marketing and regulations, we really have to look at the digital space. So that's 1. 2, we know the school environment. So what we're seeing is the typical promotion, sponsorship of physical activity events. We've also seen recently installments, whether it's a mural or learning cues. So these are permanent fixtures in schools with brand logos. Again, very concerning because children are now seeing these brands and these logos every single day. We've also seen in supermarkets. So our CSO network kind of came together during the back to school promotion time period and assessed supermarkets and how they were marketing. And it was quite overwhelming to see, again, how they're targeting parents and how they're targeting children. And lastly, what we're also seeing is corporate washing. but specifically greenwashing. So a lot of the entities are really promoting this environmentally friendly recycling initiatives and targeting schools. That's a no-no. We've seen what happened with Coca-Cola and COP26. It just doesn't go together. We know that some of the activities and the manufacturing of these products are harmful to not only the planet, but also human health. So that's a no-no, but that's another thing that we're seeing. And just lastly, I'll say, as Maisha said earlier about the heterogeneous companies, we do realize that we need to kind of meet in the middle. So we do have some companies that are promoting their water brand and will sponsor physical activity events for children. So that's kind of our middle meet where we're allowing these companies to sponsor using their healthier alternative, because we know that we need sponsorship. And so that's kind of our meeting halfway.
That's such a clever in for companies, though, using green marketing, because the entire world is now focused on climate change. Cole, I see your chair swaying from side to side. I'm assuming that you're on the hill, but the next question is for you. When we think about the many determinants of health, there is an increasing recognition of the legal determinants of health and the power of law in creating health equity and health justice. How can the law be used as a tool to address conflicts of interest and counter interference? You're muted still, although I'm getting pretty good at reading lips now.
Oh my goodness. I mean, 2.5 years and I still made that error. Yes, the law is a really powerful tool generally in the public health space, and a tool that perhaps hasn't been fully appreciated until most recently, and specifically as it relates to conflict of interest and controlling industry interference. We have like a range of responses. So at the top end, like the strongest response is that you can have something like the Framework Convention Against Tobacco, which is a binding legal, it's an international agreement, it's legally binding, and it requires that governments protect the public health space. Specifically, Article 5.3 says to them, you are under a positive obligation to protect the space, recognizing that there's an inherent conflict, as Maisha was pointing to, between the interests of the food and beverage industry and public health. Outside of that, you have, and unfortunately, the FCTC is really the only example we have of that sort of hard binding sort of approach, but that's not the only approach that you can have. And so you have what we may say are softer or soft law approaches, and those can range from things like staff codes, public service codes. So for example, St. Lucia has provisions in their public service code relating to to conflict of interest in terms of the interaction between civil servants and industry. And then also on the hard end, to be fair, on the hard end, what we have as well at a domestic level is Freedom of Information Act, because as Danielle and Maisha's presentations kind of highlight, what's key here really is sort of having a sense of what's happening and having the information, knowing what's taking place, to be able to identify, okay, that's a problem or that's something that needs to be addressed. And so a number of our territories have Freedom of Information Acts. Barbados unfortunately does not, but Trinidad does, Jamaica does, and a number of the OECF countries do as well. And those Freedom of Information Acts are very much premised on this idea about accountability and transparency. And they give a right to individuals to request certain information. Now, the only challenge that you have in those instances is that they are some public interest exceptions, so national security. And so sometimes you can have some very broad exceptions that might go counter to this effort to try to get information. But the idea is that is an important tool and can be an important way of getting information, which in many cases in the Caribbean, the challenge that we have is so much of this stuff takes place behind closed doors that you don't really know that it's happening. So like how Barbara is saying, in the context of the FOPWL, you don't have anything documented to say what went down. And so Yes, so those I would say would be the key sort of responses that we can have. So ranging from hard law at the domestic and international level, something like the FCTC Article 5.3 or a Freedom of Information Act like in Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago, and then coming down looking at things like staff codes, codes of conduct, public service orders, those sorts of things.
Thanks, Nicole. I know I'm coming back around on the second round of questions, but I wanted to just throw this out there to you to think about, who is the jury in all of this? And does the jury really understand what the verdict means? What's our role there? All right, so Annalie, I just left a group of medical students who said to me, you're doing a conflict of interest webinar. Why? Because they couldn't see a relation. And I know that some public health professionals, including dietetics and nutrition specialists, many of whom are employed by or provide consultancy for companies that actually produce health harming foods. Now, can you talk about some of the challenges dietetics and nutrition professionals face as they try to kind of navigate this conflict of interest? Bearing in mind, you have to get paid at the end of the day, right? Are there ways in which dietetics and nutrition professionals can actually engage with the food industry without a conflict of interest? I'm so glad you have this question that isn't thrown to a medic. Go ahead.
All right, yes. So the thing is, for health professionals, we do have an ethical responsibility to act in the way that is going to be the best for our patients or our clients. When the client is the business, that is something separate, but we have to first think about what our training is and for our clients. So any situation that challenges this is actually a conflict of interest. So for example, if we were to ever recommend or promote a food or beverage that has a clear negative health impact, that's a conflict of interest because we should not be doing that. Or, responding to a client who may have, limited income. And maybe they get donations. Maybe there's a family member or somebody who can give them foods which, we're sure it's already high in fat, high in sugar. The goal is always to try to explain to somebody how to eat in a healthy way. But when there are very little healthy options available to them, that can be a conflict of interest, and we have to separate our emotional response to what the science says about what they have available or what is potentially being donated to them. But at the same time, I like a question too. So yes, we're still professionals, we're not volunteer workers necessarily. So how do we engage ethically? And the key thing to remember is the food industry is very important. I mean, I used to work in the food industry. We need to eat. And even in my role there, and whether it's a regulatory role or an educational role, is to be able to provide information that can help the business to make effective decisions. So as a scientist, as a researcher, as a health professional, we can engage by providing the information, but not by being a part of the marketing effort. So here are some examples of what it could look like in terms of providing the information, but without being a marketer. So perhaps a recipe is being developed. Perhaps there can be a system for evaluating the nutrition content of these recipes and, how they would contribute to a typical day's intake, assuming that you're looking at what the World Health Organization is recommending. That is an informational role. That is different from saying you should promote it in this way. This is, or you can even say you are able to promote it in this way, but you should not be a part of the act of the actual promotion. So you can say, this has enough vitamin C, based on what the FAO says is the recommendation that it should have per day, for example. To also look to see whether particular activities are going to be aligning with the regulations, the labeling guidelines, any food policies, and even developing educational messages for campaigns, for labels. But again, we're developing the messaging, but we're not the ones actively involved in marketing it. So,
marketing, yeah.
And this education has to now be science-based. We're not saying we're giving this to you for you to somehow misuse it. We're saying this is the information, please use it responsibly, and we now leave it to them to use it responsibly. So it's basically about being an information source rather than, the marketer. And to also be clear too, because something that I learned when I was a student was that, there's no such food as an unhealthy food. And in the food industry, that is also common language. But when you look at the science, that's actually not true. There are some foods which if you have them at a particular level, they will lead to negative health impacts in the short term and over time. And if you were to remove them from a diet even for 3 days or a week, significant metabolic differences. But that's not something that is necessarily said in the food industry, you know? So it's to be aware of the differences in definitions and to be clear when you're providing your services that, hey, this is the established definition. I will not necessarily use one that is not in keeping with what I have been trained in.
Think about this. What do you do when your scientific information is weaponized by industry? How do you address that? And I'll come back to that in the second round. But so Jeff, let's move to your backdrop looks freezing. But so we have been speaking about the Caribbean. Let us now move beyond our shores. You are a no stranger to HCC, of course. In fact, you've been working with us on the issue of conflict of interest since 2017. Previous panelists have been sharing some of the challenges of conflict of interest in our regional space in health governance. Do you see similar issues in global governance or even in the UN system? And if so, what types of challenges does this create?
Thanks very much, Kenneth, and thanks to everyone for the invitation to join what's a really kind of fabulous and important conversations. And so many things that have already been said get echoed in my part of the world and in the other parts of the world where I do research. And we have similar problems with medical students at this end as well, but I'd love to get a chance to talk to those at some point. But in particular, I think that, you know, my show was relaying the conversation with Sir Trevor about the dominance of multi-stakeholderism and how that really kind of inclusive, you know, very kind of accessible language. What's not to like about everyone being involved, about multi-sectoral approaches? It's very difficult to challenge. And particularly when that gets converted into multi-stakeholderism and the idea that everyone has a stakeholder and everyone has a legitimate and equal voice, then kind of challenging those dynamics gets really difficult. And even more so, I would say, at an international level, because, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals tell us this is the way in which policy making should happen, that partnership is the key to the achievement of the SDGs. And, you know, the goal 17 that underpins all of the SDGs is all about partnership, particularly with private sector actors. So at those kind of highest levels, these kind of tensions play out in very similar ways. And there may, of course, be all sorts of contexts in which that's entirely appropriate. But equally, we know that there's an increasing range of issues where we've got very strong evidence base that there's a really kind of problematic approach. So to take one very recent obvious example, a number of you will have been following conversations at the COP on climate change governance in Egypt. The COP, of course, was brought to you by those nice people at Coca-Cola. So you had the world's biggest polluter of single-use plastics being an official sponsor of climate change negotiations. And I must admit, there's not much that makes my jaw drop these days after 20-odd years working in this field, but that did initially. Right. And then when you think, actually, this is actually the logic of the SDGs, and this is what's so challenging about these conversations, because you know, it suggests that everyone can contribute, that there aren't any kind of fundamental tensions that can't just be addressed by goodwill. And we see this playing out in food context. If we look at the UN Food System Summit last year, very strong emphasis on voluntary commitments, on everyone can be a food system hero, on engaging pesticides producers, ultra-processed food companies via voluntary commitments rather than kind of challenging these tensions. And so we need to kind of unpack these. And I think this is a really important conversation and a really important moment. And I've got to say that I absolutely love the Make It Make Sense campaign. I think it's a really important way into these issues. My one complaint is that it's much better than anything I've come up with in trying to articulate these kind of issues, because to me, it's got kind of two messages within it. One is that it's about a call for policy coherence, that things have got to work, have got to balance across each other. We can't be doing things that undermine in ways that undermine objectives. Mm-hmm. And underlying that is that central task of we've got to stop doing things that we know don't work. And NCDs, because there's been such limited investment over time, very often we do things internationally just to be seen to be doing something, and that's just not good enough. We can only be focusing our attention on things that we know work. And I do think this is a really powerful campaign to begin to focus on these kind of tensions in very accessible and sensible ways.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And we can always broker a deal with HCC in our Make It Make Sense campaign. So Maisha, let's move back to you. And I really like this question because it's kind of a devil's advocate, at least the way I'm going to phrase it. So successful NCD responses require an all of society multi-sectoral response, recognizing determinants of health largely rest outside of health. So how has this multi-sectoral response sanctioned a seat for actors with vested incompatible interess at the policy-making table, which we started speaking about, right? And ultimately undermining the integrity of the policy-making process. We kind of started off by saying, to fix this problem, we want the good, the bad, and the ugly there to kind of get dissected. Is that really what we want in the room?
Yeah, and I think thank you for the question. Kenneth, before I get going, I want to apologize to the audience. We did, in fact, attempt to enable the chat before we started this webinar, and it seems it's not enabled. So we're working on this, just to let everyone know. We're trying to get it up and active. In the time being, if you can, use the Q&A function if you have questions or comments that you would like us to raise to the broader audience.
Sure.
So that, yeah, Kenneth, this is a constant theme that we're dealing with. And I think, you know, in the visionary minds of those many years ago, back in 2011 and 2007, when we realized, yes, this was an all of society, whole of sector approach we needed to mobilize. We didn't think forward and, you know, what are the safeguards we need to put in place to make sure that, yes, we do have consultation, because we do need the perspectives and opinions of stakeholders who will be impacted. But we don't need them at the policymaking table. And I was struck by a comment the other day made by a colleague who works globally, who said, you know, your front of package warning labeling process is very interesting, and that I've not seen anywhere in the globe a process which allows the private sector, who has vested interests, as we know, around the labels that are placed on foods. They don't necessarily want these big black labels on their foods. I've never seen anywhere else that allows them to not only participate in the consultations, but to participate in the vote, where they actually have a vote. And so I was struck by that, because we've heard very much, you know, that the standards process is very much a multi-sectoral process. And yes, it is, but not when it comes to the vote. I think what we have tried to do at the HCC, and working with partners like PAHO, as well as with thought leaders like Jeff, and colleagues across the region, is start to raise this discussion within the public sector, outside of health. This idea of the need for policy coherence and the need for awareness around these conflicts of interest. And it's been really eye-opening to see what we think is a very insular public health group advocating for these kinds of safeguards and awareness around interference, the kind of lack of awareness outside of health of conflict of interest. And it's so we've created a primer, and we're working with non-health actors, and we've also created a policy to be used as a template. And that policy was very much guided by work with Jeff and PAHO. So I think as we look forward to solutions and how we kind of try to modify this multi-sectoral platform, we really need to do, in addition to building out those tools, we need to do a lot of sensitization around why this is important.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think we spend a lot of time sensitizing the health sector, but what about the other sectors outside of health? They don't seem to even get the whole conflict of interest, or sometimes they ignore it. Daniel, I'm back up to you again. And so young people, actually, no, it's Barbara, but Daniel, I started chatting. So and you're center in my screen, so I'll go with you next. Young people are heavily targeted by unhealthy commodities industries as lifelong loyal consumers of products, which significantly increase their risk of NCDs. And some of those young people are in this very room with me and are associated with morbidity and mortality. So how can we engage youth voices on this topic of conflict of interest and industry interference, which undermines the very policies which seek to protect them.
Thanks, Dr. Connell. And you and Maisha kind of started on this whole idea of this multi-sectoral approach and the sensitization. Youth definitely need to be involved in that sensitization. So I would say two things. The first is that we need to just ask them. We need to kind of get a sense of what their thoughts are around it. And so the Jamaica Youth Advocacy Network, we partnered with them and the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Barbados to do a U report. So this is assessing the views of youth across the region. And we specifically asked them about advertising and marketing of unhealthy foods and beverages to children. And I just wanted to make sure I have the stat correct. 75% of those who responded said that they see unhealthy food and beverage advertising daily or several times daily. So again, we're getting a sense of what they're thinking. Thankfully, 70% of them, so this is again, youth outside of this, our health space, support a policy that would regulate the marketing of unhealthy foods and beverages to children. So I think finding and creating spaces that allow for that conversation to happen and for us to get a sense of where their heads are at is a really great start. Second to that is building their capacity. So if they are interested, especially in conflict of interest, industry interference, healthy food policy, again, creating spaces for them to share information and for them to feel a bit more comfortable and competent in advocating if that's what they're interested in. Mm-hmm. So some of the things that we've done, that supermarket audit that I mentioned earlier, we specifically asked our CSOs to identify youth to do that audit. Right. So they were seeing it firsthand for themselves. This is not just us telling them what kind of see in supermarkets, they were seeing it for themselves. So that's one way to do it. Another thing we've done recently is having workshops. So actually bringing youth, not just in health, outside health together, to broach these sorts of topics and have a conversation. But in that conversation, we're not just chatting, but we're also giving information and talking about it. And then last thing is just in that building capacity is providing the resources. So I'm very, very pleased to share that recently, well, this week, Mr. Pierre Cook, our technical advisor, he authored a resource called Our Health, Our Right. And it's a rights-based agenda to childhood obesity prevention. And when we're talking about conflict of interest and when we're talking about marketing, that rights-based approach, I'm looking at Nicole, that rights-based approach is so important, right? And so now with Pierre's new agenda, we have a resource that that rights-based approach is core, and that's what youth can use to advocate. So those two main things, creating a space for them to hear their inputs, but also creating a space where we are able to build their capacity in this area.
Thanks very much for saying that. And the virtual and the live audience here appreciate your comments. Thank you very much. So Barbara, I want to move over to Jamaica now, and you have a long experience with tobacco advocacy. Can you share some of the strategies the Heart Foundation of Jamaica used in countering interference and conflicts of interest on learnings from the tobacco experience?
Okay, well, what we realize, if you do a quick search, you will find that Big Food markets to kids using the tobacco industry playbook. So we have already seen that, and that has been going on for some time. So because of that, in some way, we have to use our tobacco tactics to try to match what's going on there. The main thing is that you still have to look at your evidence base. If the information is there and the information is shared, we just have to find ways to have that in the public or or the policymakers to have a very clear idea. But the tactics are similar, and they have definitely worked on children using cartoon characters and advertising during particular times, you know. I think it's a bit challenging, meaning to that, at least with tobacco, we know 50% of all persons that use tobacco will die at some stage. So the data is there, the monkey is on the back. With the food industry, as I mentioned earlier, the fact is that even if the foods are unhealthy, it depends on how much you use them. If you are going to have it every day, or if you're going to have it once a week. There is a difference. So there's a slight difference in terms of the health effects. You know, as Annalie was saying, though, if you do use these products over a period of time, you know, you can have, you know, health effects. So we use evidence-based, we do the promotions, we look online, you know, and we try to put together documents that will show the difference. Also, we try to do a lot of work with youth too, you know, with our school programs and that kind of thing. So basically, that's it.
Great. Yeah. So the tobacco template is important. Interestingly, someone has put in the chat though that everyone needs to eat, not everyone needs to smoke. So that's something maybe we can come back to at the next round. Okay. So Nicole, we're back to you. Interestingly, so why is this issue of private sector diluting, delaying, and derailing, I like the alliteration, of public policy, a human rights issue? And do businesses also have human rights obligations when it comes to conflict of interest and health harming products? Again, the background question is, who is the jury? And is the jury even aware of the implications of the verdict? Go ahead, Nicole, you're muted.
Yes, Kenneth. No, it is very much a human rights issue, and it's a human rights issue because we know that, as you started off by saying, these actions, and as Mike just spoke to, these actions, these activities impact health. And we have a right to health, but health is also related to some other rights as well. As we know, rights are interconnected, they're interdependent. And so it's not even just about the right to health. That's just the opening stat. But then once you're in that space, really it is a rights issue across the board. And what we have seen is, what we know is that from an international human rights law perspective, governments have an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill our right to health and the other rights, yes? And in terms of protection, that protection obligation specifically requires governments to take steps to prevent others from taking action that would infringe on persons' rights, including the right to health. And so we have seen, for example, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. A few years ago, he wrote about the connection between NCDs, unlawful foods, and the right to health, and the fact that there were very clear obligations that were being violated by government's failure to act in terms of regulating the business sector. And these obligations are not unique to, as I said, any one instrument. We can be talking about the Covenant on the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but there's also to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The messaging and the law is quite clear. And then in addition, sort of picking up on that dimension, because that really speaks to the state as the principal duty bearer in the context of the right to health, or rights generally. But what we have seen is that increasingly over time, there's become an increasing sense that it is not sufficient to just focus on states in the context of trying to realize rights to health and other rights. And so in 2011, we actually had the UN come up with what are called guiding principles on human rights and business. And in that, those principles attempt to articulate some of the responsibilities that the private sector has to take action to ensure to protect persons' health, to not take actions that undermine their health. Now, in much the same way like I was speaking just now, we have hard law and we have soft law. So the guiding principles are not at the level of like the international covenant. States are very much still seen as the principal duty bearers, but increasingly, as I said, we're having more and more discussion in this space about what types of action it might be appropriate to expect businesses to be able to take, bearing in mind the very critical role that they play in this space. So it's very much a human rights issue across the board, even if you look at it from a traditional perspective, but even now that space continues to evolve.
Sure. So Nicole, you know, I hear you, but I somehow think that the man and woman on the street has somehow translated the right to healthcare access as the right to health. And they're willing to champion that right to healthcare access, but they're not really sure about the right to health. And maybe that's something the narrative has to evolve and be a bit more structured. So go ahead.
Yeah,
you want
certainly there's a big difference between the right to health. The right is the right to health. Health care would be part of that, but the right to health is an all-inclusive, all-encompassing right, not limited to not being sick. It's
absolutely
enjoying the highest attainable standard of health with all that entails. And there's certainly some additional educational work for us to do in helping build awareness of that.
Sure. Thanks for that. So Annalie, you are actually part of a nutrition research team in the region, and you're exploring healthy food policy and previously worked in the food industry as a nutritionist. Increasingly, we are seeing investigative pieces highlighting the extent to which some actors in the food industry will go to manipulate the science through direct or indirect funding or sitting on research boards, etc. And I work for an academy, and that's all I'll say. Are we seeing this in the Caribbean? And what safeguards can we put in place to prevent this?
All right, so it's a big question. So I look at it in different parts. One, yes, so in the Caribbean, as everywhere else, we do have research that's happening. And for example, I can speak on an example when I was in the food industry. I was managing a nutrition education program for children, and for credibility, it was clear that we could not be the ones to evaluate our own program. So we had reached out to a university to do those evaluations for us. In the end, I wasn't there when it was done, so I don't know what happened to it. In a system like that, if when we got the results, then we were happy to share them, that would have been great. If we got the results and then we're like, our program isn't working, we won't share, then that would have been bad. So I wasn't there, so I do not know what happened with that. But I do know of at least one situation in the region where an organization reached out to a nutrition-related researcher to provide funding, resources, a lot of things that the research team would really value. But then there was a caveat in that particular instance that if when the results come, that the board of the organization, not the researchers organization, but the funding organization, which is actually food industry funded, would need to approve the results. That is suggesting that there's going to be some level of management of the public image, that the results are only going to be the ones that are favorable in that particular instance. So as a researcher, I'm not saying that every industry player does this. I would hope not, but clearly it does happen in some instances. So that's one example. Another example, though, this time it's not a research board, but it's a government level decision-making process. It is where the opportunity is there for currently in the Caribbean for the food industry to be an active part of the discussion, but as Maisha mentioned earlier, also actively a part of the voting. The interesting thing in our situation, though, is, there are 5 stakeholder groups, right? There is government, that's one. There is industrial or the private sector. There is consumers. There is academics, and there is, I think, NGOs, right? I believe. But interestingly, the industry preferences and interests is representing on 3 of those, not only in industry groups. So what we're seeing as well is the system currently in the Caribbean is not properly set up. Yes, they are an important part, and I mean, I used to be a part of the food industry, an important part of getting the job done. But if your interest is above all profits, and your interest of profit is represented in a consumer group and also in a government group, and this is actually a government-led policy that really should be about health, then for the trade aspect of the government to be preventing the government vote from actually being about health is at conflict. So we basically have 5 stakeholder groups with the industry interest not represented on 1 but on 3. So what is my recommendation? I have experienced both sides. So I believe there needs to be a conflict of interest policy which guides the use of evidence in health policies, right? So currently as well, we do have a situation where there has been a regional study conducted by the food industry. I think it's great that they conducted a study, but the way the study was conducted has design flaws. And even though there are research experts on the committees, it is somehow seen that the research experts' information about the fact that it is flawed is not enough. So even if there are researchers a part of the process, the system is not allowing the evidence to be what is appropriate. It's still allowing the voting system to be allowed without the level or the quality of the evidence being critical. So if the quality of the evidence doesn't matter, then how is it going to ever push forward what is in the public good?
Sure.
You know, so basically that is what needs to be managed. Earlier, let me just quickly mention, you had mentioned, you know, what happens when the science agrees with what the industry is saying? Well, then great, because science is science. But if the science disagrees with what the industry is saying, then that's the challenge.
Yeah.
If they want to push forward their perspective as opposed to an unbiased perspective.
Yeah. You know, I'm going to go to Jeff, but hearing you speak, there seems to be a need for even something like a regional university to have a very clear conflict of interest document, even directed towards our institutional review boards that approve research. That's not stated in the research application. Perhaps that policy needs to be implemented. Jeff, so final question here in this round, but conflict of interest and industry interference is very much an issue of power exacerbated in our small island developing states settings. What kinds of tools do member states need to empower them to overcome the power of the imbalances that hamper the ability to or inability to regulate the food environment?
That's a big question.
It is.
But it's such an important one, and I think, you know, we've got to recognise that the power asymmetries here are fundamental to understanding the NCD burdens in small island states around the world, and these are really, you know, big drivers of the global political economy that we're talking with, and which small island states are bearing the brunt of. At the same time, I think it's really important to not to present industries as being all powerful in these contexts. You know, small island states, particularly in the Caribbean, have got a really remarkable track record of innovative global leadership in this space, and the story of the spread of SSB taxes around the world and the contribution of the Caribbean to that is really important in that context. There are different forms of power, different forms of authority and legitimacy that, you know, that all kinds of people involved in this conversation in the region have been able to leverage. That said, I think that task would be easier and more effective if we were able to provide better resources to policymakers in managing the kind of tensions that they're subject with, and sometimes that's being more aware of resources which are available and better publicizing and communicating resources that are available. So, you know, Maisha mentioned earlier that PAHO are doing a lot of work in this space, including developing some really, I think, excellent online resources to help health officials, civil society actors in managing conflict of interest in nutrition policy, really making these kind of issues very accessible and quite simple to work through. I think the work that HCC have been doing in this space in thinking about how to reconcile tensions within multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral settings is really important. I think Nicole's point about making better use of broader forms of law and guidance like public service codes is really important. You know, we've just done an international study on implementing Article 5.3 and public service codes around conflict of interest are really important. And one kind of way in which that's helpful is that putting it in that kind of context allows us to think about conflict of interest as an issue of good governance, about promoting transparency and accountability, and loses some of the kind of antagonistic, anti-business tone that can sometimes frame our discussions here, and often that can be helpful, but it can also be quite difficult in terms of bringing other colleagues on board, particularly colleagues from other ministries working with different mandates and with different expectations about who they're responsible to. So thinking about how we can reframe a conflict of interest governance from a kind of problematic conversation to a really constructive, positive, forward-looking conversation, and thinking about a broader range of of contexts in which we can use those is important. And this is somewhere where I think small islands can have some significant advantages. You know, there are strengths about small island contexts of everybody knowing everybody, of being very close communities. There are some potential advantages in terms of leveraging greater coordination across ministries, for example, which I think some of the COVID experience in the region speaks to as well. So I think that the situation is actually a more positive one than the starkness of the question perhaps suggests, and that we do have emerging resources that are going to help to manage this more proactively in the future.
Sure, thanks very much. So we are now at the 2 minutes ahead of the time for questions. But Nicole, I really want to press you on this one. Who is the jury? And is the jury aware of what the verdict means?
So it depends in the context. So as with all things, if you're dealing with law, I mean, the jury can be different persons depending on the forum. So it's not every dispute that necessarily law is there accessible to everybody, and we all read it and we make our own determinations about whether we fall within the scope or not. What will happen is that every now and again we'll have a dispute. Something rises to the level of two of us not agreeing that this fits within the parameters that as we have set it out, and then we take it to a higher authority, which is where the courts will come in and rule. But really, this is as I said, there's no one set jury. It's really what is critical in this space, to my mind, is building awareness and understanding so that we empower each person in their respective spaces to be able to make the best decisions possible, understanding how interconnected this issue is, how nuanced it is, and then, as we said, the specificities of small island developing states, and drawing on all the different tools, PAHO, HCC, etc., to allow that to happen.
Thanks for that. So we're now officially into our questions segment. But I don't see any questions in the chat. Maisha, you can let me know if I've missed any.
No, there are no questions in the chat, and maybe we can move to there are some comments, and I think maybe we can respond to a few of them.
Sure.
And I think one of them I wanted to share. I think we have a really good example of conflict of interest in the study that was done at the regional level by the Caribbean Private Sector Organization on front of package warning labels. And, we've seen evidence, scientific evidence, and I'm sure Jeff and other colleagues and Annalee can speak to this, about the types of when science is funded by those with vested interests, oftentimes the outcomes are quite predictable. And so I'll say that the study that was undertaken by the CPSO to determine the most appropriate front of package label, and I think it's very important to understand the acronyms. There's a broad category of labels that are called their front of package labels, FOPL, but there's a subset, the warning labels, and you'll see FOPWL. Sorry, I've got some construction here. And so the warning label is what we're advocating for. And so unsurprisingly, the CPSO study found that the most appropriate label for the region was two models of FOPL, which were traffic light and the facts up front. And this was one of the very few studies globally that ever found that those two warning labels were more effective than the octagonal warning label.
Right.
And so the findings were unsurprising, and the response from the public health community, including PAHO, CARFA, UNICEF, the OECS Commission, was really a letter which was sent to ministers of state and ministers of trade, a letter really stating that this study represented a clear conflict of interest. And so in addition to the flaws that Annalee highlighted in the actual methodology, there were clear concerns around this entity, a private sector entity, conducting a scientific study on this issue, which would affect which represents direct conflict of interest. So I wanted to mention that, and just mention that there's a difference between supporting front of package labels and supporting front of package warning labels. And I think Annalee also mentioned the study that was done in Jamaica by PAHO, the Ministry of Health and University of Technology, which found consistently, and it was consistent with global data, that the warning labels, the black octagons, consistently outperformed other front of package labels And this is not unique. So I think that clarification is very important. And I'm going to stop there and open it up for others to comment. I think there's one comment I would like just ask Nicole to comment on this idea of recommending multiple labels for CARICOM. We isn't inherent in the kind of just the principles of CARICOM is harmonization. So this idea of multiple labels, I would love to hear Nicole's comment on that.
Hi, Maisha. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add on to your explanation as well about FOPWL, is that the performance as well, what is also important to bear in mind is, and that's where industry can sometimes confuse persons, is if you have different goals, right? So the goals in terms of the study that was conducted by the Institute for Technology and Ministry of Health Jamaica was that they wanted a system that was simple, was easy to understand, and was accurate, right? And when you use those 3 yardsticks, every time consistently, the octagonal warning labels win out. Now, if you use a different set of goalposts, maybe you might get a different result. But the idea is that if we need to compare apples and apples, right? If we're saying that this is the stated goal for this measure, then you need to measure it up against that. So I just wanted to add that as well in terms of how there can be sometimes some confusion that is sold in terms of performance of these systems. In terms of specifically the question that Maisha posed, comment that Maisha posed in terms of harmonization, I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't make sense to have multiple systems, right? CARICOM, the whole point of having a regional standard was that you want one standard that is going to apply across all the regions. Yeah. Otherwise, everybody could have just stayed at home and just implemented their own system themselves. So it kind of makes a nonsense of the whole regional process to end up saying, hey, well, our regional standard, it isn't really a regional standard. It's a whatever you feel like doing between these two. So, so Barbados, you can go with option A, and then maybe Jamaica might go with option B. And so all over the Caribbean, we'd have combinations and permutations of A and B, which end up going counter to the whole purpose of going a regional space, which is to have one thing that creates uniformity and harmonization, and therefore minimizes the frictions in terms of trade. Because if my standard is different to your standard, then your goods can't come into my territory the same way as mine can come into yours.
Yeah,
it's that simple.
And that's a serious implication because it prevents free trade in between throughout the region. Which is then going to be weaponized then to say, well, let's forget the whole standards thing because, we need free trade.
You got it.
Yeah, I mean, but what I'm hearing though, there seems to be an elephant in the room. Actually, there are two elephants that I've identified. One is there's a lot of political determinants, and our elected officials don't have to declare conflicts of interest, but they're the key kind of stakeholders that determine policy. Should our elected individuals have to declare a conflict of interest so that the jury again knows clearly who they're electing and they can kind of hedge it on that? Does anyone have thoughts on that? I know it's controversial, but what are your thoughts? Jeff, I see you smiling.
Yeah, smiling though was a slightly pained smile. It's a really difficult question, and I mean internationally, this is something that that colleagues have really struggled with in trying to implement Article 5.3. Speaking about it as being relevant to government officials is one thing. It's just really difficult to try and do that in the context of political officials. Again, of course, we prefer. I think if we're trying to use the language of transparency and accountability, then encouraging those kind of disclosures would seem appropriate. But it's a difficult ask. I do also think that while it's important, it might be a bit of a red herring in strategic terms. That I'm not necessarily sure that it's it's a really difficult fight, and I'm not sure that it would perhaps necessarily be as transformative as we perhaps assume. That's not to deny the relevance of some of those conflicts that do exist, but I think that in terms of conflict of interest, we've got to concentrate on public health getting its house in order. and really thinking through the dynamics of health governance a bit more clearly. To some extent, that means not focusing quite so much on industry as we have done. You know, industry does what it's supposed to do, and there's a risk of kind of demonizing the industry too much, and that's particularly the case in, you know, the food industry is such a difficult construct. So I think the real challenge here is how do we get health governance functioning in ways that make sense, to steal somebody's phrase of the day.
Sure.
Yeah. Kenneth, if I could just jump in there quickly. I think I agree with Jeff very much that I wouldn't want us to just focus, you know, to have these artificial, in a sense, focus on we want you to declare this and we want you to declare that. That really what we want substantively is, as he said, to address, because once we address the conflict of interest at the level of policy making, the rest is taken care of. You know, once we have a proper governance system in place, then we have the necessary checks and balances that will allow for an outcome that is appropriate, and not so much focus on the individual players, but try to look at it systemically and ensure that you have a governance system and structure that makes sense from that perspective.
Sure. So I don't want to finish this webinar, this very intense discussion, without speaking about solutions. So I'm going to ask each of you to give me, what do you think, where do you think we should go from here? And I'll start with randomly, and Annalise, since your hand is up, I'll ask you to respond. Where do we go from here?
Okay, so, and I'll also respond to a question from Mr. Anguli from Joy. So yes, the Jamaica study was funded by the Pan American Health Organization, but here are some caveats which I don't know if the CPSO study had. The PAHO, MOH, UA, and the UTEC have independent ethical bodies, which means it has to go to an institutional review process. Even the persons who are participating in that literally have to go through training, because these are bodies that do not only engage with just one type of organization. So even within PAHO, I am sure they have to work with trade. Even at UTEC and JUE, they're not necessarily like health allied. They have a number of banners that they work with. So having said that, I think one of the things that we need to do is, let's say the CPSO wants to do a study in the future. It would be very helpful if the institutional review came from a body that has the regional perspective of how to analyze the data. Not only that, but even to allow some of the experts, like even on these teams, to be a part of the study design. What happened was, and I saw that Miss Carrie, you know, that somebody from the CPSO mentioned that, you know, a comprehensive response was submitted, but do you realize that you only gave the opportunity for validation once the study was completed, you know? So I personally think as scientists, we should all be working together. I do think that as a researcher, we can be working with trade, definitely, why not? But give us the opportunity not to only be providing a rebuttal, because that's not helpful. What we want is the help in the designing of studies. So it's for it to be truly multi-sectoral, please provide opportunities where conflicts of interest can be managed upfront, because it seems a little bit backwards if we're doing it on the back end, because then we can't really achieve our objectives together.
Yeah, the horse is already around at least the track at least 5 times when the research is published. And this is why I say it speaks to the whole research policy and ethics, and on what we are prepared to allow even to be part of research. And this is where the regional IRBs have a strong role to play, and even the regional institution academy like UWI has a role to play in that as well. So where do we go from here? You thought you were off the spot, but where do we go from here? Annalie?
Yeah, man, I'm saying, so where we go from here is not just looking at, okay, industry interest, health interest. Let's look at what the science say, even look at what the processes are, and see, okay, so how can we work together, if at all, because currently it feels as though we're not. It's a thing through, okay, so what is the goal? So for example, as a health professional, how do I engage? I need to partner with the health industry, because my expertise, health professionals' expertise is needed. So I can provide information which they can use, but there has to be a standard with which it is used. I do know that some companies have them, but to the extent that it is global, to the extent that even those policies are at the government level, no. So it has to be that each country has to have its own conflict of interest policy that can guide the industry. It should not be that, because unfortunately, when I was working in the food industry, unfortunately, there were times for that particular company when the industry standard was stronger than the government standard. And I'm thinking, at the time, I was very impressed, but now I'm understanding that this was an international company that has developed certain systems. But so many other times, it's a case where if the industry has to respond to something, like because it's regulatory, then that is because the government has put it in place. But if there is no standard, then any standard may work, which is partly what is happening. So it needs to be that there are clear standards, clear conflicts of interest that the industry can then respond to and participate in, rather than, you know, recommending something in a voluntary basis, which may not eventually be helpful. Because clearly, if I want to make money, you know, my interest is making money, you know, so the interest of making money may conflict with the public health. Therefore, there has to be a generic system which is not focused on the interest of making money, but on the rights of the public. And if we have that in place and we're all working with that as a framework, then we're in a good place.
Okay, we are now down to 1 minute closing shots. So where do we go from here, Nicole?
So I think I agree with Annalie. We need to be thinking in terms of developing individual conflict of interest policies. And in that regard, I think stakeholder mapping as well is going to be very important in terms of seeing some of those players who are maybe non-traditional in the health space that we can partner with to avoid some of these conflicts of interest. So our fallback is often to these food and beverage companies who are always in this space and always ready to pull out a checkbook, but also so develop the conflict of interest for when we have those problems, but also to explore alternatives to some of those problematic actors. And that involves stakeholder mapping. That's it.
Thanks very much. That was 58 seconds. Well done. Danielle, where do we go from here?
Thanks, Dr. Connell. After speaking with youth over my period here at the HCC, one thing that they continue to ask for is information and access to information. So I think ongoing advocacy for, as Nicole mentioned, the Freedom of Information Acts, because if, as a youth advocate, I'd like to get a better idea of what's happening at the cross-SKU level, I don't know where to go. That information is not available. If I want to get a better understanding of the healthy food policy process, I don't know where to go. So ongoing advocacy for access to information.
Thanks very much. And Jeff, closing shots. Where do we go from here?
Great. Well, I'm going to go back to the international level and the SDGs, and I'm going to say ensure policy coherence for sustainable development. That everything we do in an NCD space has got to make sense in health terms and also in economic terms. And we can use developments of conflict of interest policies as good governance tools to promote policy coherence. And I think it's a really helpful way of reframing the conversation in some contexts to demonstrate that, you know, we do take multiple goals into account, we do take economic objectives into account, but health has to have its place in the conversation as well.
And a stronger place. Barbara, closing shots.
Okay, closing shots. One of the easiest one is just, I agree with everyone. However, it's very, very important to do the things like the conflict of interest policies and donation policies, food donation. And that is important whenever you have pandemics. It doesn't have to be, you know, COVID or anything like that. And also we need a FCTC for food. Because if we had that, it took a long time to get the FCTC. They took years to put that together. But some kind of similar program that would incorporate the various articles. So a FCTC for food would be what I would like to see. And of course, the importance of policy at any level to protect the health of our population.
I like that one. Thank you. Thank you for that, Barbara. So Maisha, I'm going to hand the baton over to you partially, but what are your closing shots? Where do we go from here?
Well, I was going to ask you for your closing shots, Kenneth.
Yeah. So I think that we need to change the conversation to convince, as Nicole pointed out initially, the jury and getting the jury sensitized into the implications of conflict of interest, because I don't think they understand that. The average Caribbean citizen doesn't even understand the right to health. As I said, it is kind of being distorted with the right to health care. I also think we need to appreciate that there are going to be regional nuances, but we cannot allow them to weaponize the whole effort of conflict of interest. And interestingly, someone sent me, and this really speaks back to the whole core of CARICOM. Someone sent me an interesting message that, Nicole, that you probably just summed up one of our major challenges, that this CARICOM standard for unity is actually based on individualism. And that's something that we really do need to address and highlight to our CARICOM leaders, that this whole individual kind of approach is not going to work. It's going to dilute the effort and it's going to reverse what happens. So I think my final one, and I know I'm over my 1 minute, but I really would like to see as one action point, how do we manage research in the region? We cannot continue to allow publications to present themselves in our space with only kind of responding to questions. We need to get ahead of the game. How was the research conducted? Should it have been approved to begin with? What were the conflicts of interest identified? And where is that conflict of interest embedded in our research approval? And if it's not there, that's something we need to work on urgently. And I know it's not there. That's why I'm saying that. Okay. Thank you, Maisha. It's been a pleasure chairing this panel. It's very, very exciting. And the time has gone so quickly. But certainly the discussion was very appropriate. And I thank you for your comments. And over to you now for the wrap up.
Thank you, Kenneth. I'm conscious of the time. I'm also conscious of this unexpected construction that's happening next door to me. So I am going to thank all of the panelists. I don't have anything to add because I think you've all been brilliant in your closing comments and summarized everything. Before we go, I'd like to make a plug for 2 upcoming webinars. The first one is Marketing Exposed, so very much along the same vein, and that will be next week, November 30th. If you would like information on registration, just reach out to the HCC. And the second one is next week, Friday, and that's part of our annual Caribbean Alcohol Reduction Day, or CARD. And this year we're focusing on the Global Action Plan and how this translates to priorities for the Caribbean. And we would love for you to join. So with that said, I would like everyone to turn on their cameras and wish our audience goodbye. Thank you for fruitful discussion and joining us this week. Have a great weekend, everyone.